Greetings, this is Patrick, and this presentation will be focused on the merits of free markets. So these two figures are economists Milton Friedman on the left and Thomas Sowell on the right. So what this presentation will be covering are the following: what a free market is, benefits of a free market, obstacles to a free market, protectionism, regulation, taxation, sanctions, minimum wage laws, and price controls. Then we move on to supply and demand, drawbacks of a free market, and conclude with Machiavellianism. What a free market is. This is a market where enterprises have tremendous leeway in how they engage in business, being able to set the terms without having to navigate around complex laws and regulations. Government intervention is either minimal or absent altogether. This is often why free market capitalism advocates also tend to support limiting government influence, or in other words, small government. The market itself is considered as a self-stabilizing force, with the supply and demand variables balancing each other out to reach a steady state of equilibrium. Famous proponents of free market capitalism include Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, both pictured in the title page of this presentation, and Walter E. Williams. Benefits of a free market: lower costs for businesses, reducing prices of consumer goods and services, facilitates the growth of small businesses which are more able to gain footholds in the market. Increased number of businesses drives competition and innovation, resulting in improved quality and reduced costs for consumers. Easy international trade improves diplomatic relations between trading countries. Regional industries are more optimized for sectors where they have the strongest competitive advantage, improving efficiency. Obstacles to a free market: protectionism. Proponents of protectionism argue that importing goods and services from overseas harms domestic industries due to the increased competition they face. A protectionist economy, whilst promoting job security, denies domestic consumers access to cheaper and/or higher quality foreign goods. By providing safety nets to businesses, their incentive to perform is diminished, leading to inefficiencies. We see this in the poor value for money typically offered by public services as well as government programs. Broken window fallacy. Both job security and consumer surplus can be satisfied by shutting inefficient industries down and replacing them with industries in sectors where the importing country has a global competitive advantage, because of course that importing country can export the products from those industries. Regulation. Proponents of regulation argue that it is necessary for goods and services to comply with industrial standards, for instance health and safety. Regulations harm small businesses the most as they lack the resources required to navigate the complex bureaucratic frameworks, disproportionately advantaging large businesses which may engulf their smaller rivals and become monopolies. Regulations complicate the deliveries of goods and services, resulting in longer lead times and higher costs for consumers, because again, higher costs for the businesses which they tend to offload onto customers. Free market proponents argue for deregulation, but for consumers to be informed of risks so they can make decisions for themselves as responsible, autonomous adults. Taxation. This is the government's way of collecting revenue from commerce, import duties, income tax, carbon credits. Taxation imposes an additional financial burden on businesses, reducing the incentive for them to operate, leading to a reduction in product service supply. Harms small businesses the most as they lack the resources to navigate the complex tax codes and still emerge profitable. For instance, we're seeing this with Poundland, for example, where its boss is considering closing down altogether because the taxes are now too high for the business to remain sustainable. Such businesses would seek ways to offset this burden, for instance by laying staff off and passing the costs onto the consumers, again, higher prices. Sanctions. Simply put, these are trade barriers imposed by government preventing the country from importing goods from the country being sanctioned. This is seen as an economic attack on the target country as it limits its options for export destinations, usually the result of diplomatic fallouts. Similarly to protectionism, while shielding domestic industries from foreign competition, it also adversely affects domestic consumers by restricting their access to cheaper goods from overseas. So examples of countries that are currently being sanctioned by the West are Russia, North Korea, and I believe Iran as well. Minimum wage laws. These are the bare minimum rates at which companies are legally permitted to pay their staff for their labour, heavily spearheaded by labour unions, even where members are already paid well above the minimum wages that they are campaigning for. So, for example, the prominent unions we have here in Britain are ASLEF, the one for train drivers, RMT for train guards. While raising wages, these laws increase labour costs for businesses, disincentivizing them from hiring workers, making it more difficult for lower skilled workers to find employment. Walter E. Williams, a prominent economist, I mentioned him earlier, often used the example of white South Africans acknowledging their use of unions to protect their jobs from competition from lower skilled black workers back in the 1980s. Price controls. These are price caps above which businesses are not legally allowed to charge for their products and or services, intended to eliminate corporate greed via extortionate pricing, where the prices of goods and services are extreme relative to what it costs the businesses to provide them. We see this in healthcare in USA. Price controls fail to account for factors beyond the business's control that force them to raise prices to offload its own increased expenses of conducting business. Tax rates, for instance. The consequence of forcing the business to fully absorb its increased expenses is that it closes down as the profit incentive is too weak to justify its continued operation. Milton Friedman used the analogy of forcing a heavy brick over a boiling kettle whilst leaving the power on, as opposed to simply dialing the heat down. Supply and demand. This is the self-stabilizing force that establishes an equilibrium on pricing. So this equation states that price is directly proportional to demand divided by supply. For example, if for a particular product the supply is greatly reduced but the demand for it stays the same, the price will increase. An effective way to lower prices would be to reduce taxes and regulations, paving the way for small businesses to emerge to undercut the prices set by large established businesses and to flood the market with an abundant supply. The price elasticity of demand: the more expensive something is, the less inclined the consumer is to buy it, incentivizes businesses to lower unit prices and upscale the volume of sales. In a sense, price also affects demand. Drawbacks of a free market. Some attributes that make free markets advantageous are double-edged swords that carry drawbacks of their own. First, there's deregulation, where the lack of watchdogs to safeguard consumer rights may see corners being cut on product, service, quality and or safety. Secondly, competition. Certain domestic industries may be vital to the nation's economy and employment even if they are inefficient on the global scale. So for example, remote isolated islands may rely on their fishing industry. Thirdly, and this is a major one, interdependency. As the nation imports most of its goods, it is highly vulnerable to disruptions in the supply line from production to distribution, as it is not prepared to produce such goods domestically. Production lines take time and money to set up, which is not desirable when it is cheaper and more convenient to import products from overseas. A week ago I returned from a week-long vacation in Portugal towards the west of the Algarve region. I was staying in Portimao, and the day before I left there was a power failure. The electrical grid was down, apparently due to oscillations in the power supply. Most of the street lights were down. The hotel where I was staying at, the fridge, freezer, lights, microwave, they were all disabled. Even the Wi-Fi was down. I had to use the nearby Wi-Fi at the shopping mall just to do my check-in. Here's some footage that I took of myself walking down the coastal street in Portimao during that power failure at night. It's worth mentioning though that certain 4-star hotels and that shopping mall where I got my free Wi-Fi were running just because they had backup diesel generators. The point I'm trying to get across is that it may be a good idea to have backup systems in place. For example, factories that could quickly switch over to domestic production of certain goods it usually imports in case there are disruptions in the distribution. But of course, the free market only works when all the cogs in the machine are running. To conclude, Machiavellianism. This is named after the famous Italian politician Niccolo Machiavelli. This is the principle where everyone, from producer to consumer, acts on self-interest. The free market model is pragmatic as it accounts for how human behavior responds to incentives. This model maximizes the overlap between the best interests of the business with that of the customer, driving each party's actions to indirectly benefit the other. Unfortunately, the interests of these two parties are at odds with the revenue collecting and power consolidating motives of the de facto government. Therefore, for the benefits offered by free markets to be obtained, the influence of the state as an intermediary in commercial matters should be minimized, especially here in the West where governments are supposedly anyway elected through democracy. They may only remain in power for 4 to 5 years at a time. Often their policies are quite short-sighted, how to make the most of their 4 to 5 years in office rather than develop a more pragmatic longer-term strategy. Each new government in power would reverse the policies of its predecessor. It's quite an unstable, volatile political situation, I must say. So this concludes the presentation. I hope this was of insight to you.